from Z Logistics and Compliance. Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Michael. So nice being here.
Yeah, good to have you with us as well. And for those of you joining us live or on the replay, on the flip side, we are talking today about logistics and import compliance. Now, it doesn't sound like a very sexy phrase, but I can say from experience that absolutely know that the e-commerce sellers that I know in the UK, particularly, but they're not the only ones. I've had such a horrendous year of 2021 trying to get goods from the UK into Europe. It's really become complex, and of course, anyone like a lot of American sellers who are not just Amazon, but any kind of e-commerce or any kind of goods whatsoever, who are storing goods in the UK, which was previously a very nice little dropping off point as a prelude to moving into Europe with goods, have suddenly found that's very tricky for them as well. So it's a really, really important area, and compliance is something else that comes up a lot. People often will pop into a free Facebook group like the one we have and ask questions like, how do I deal with the compliance on X, Y, and Z? So it's just really a question for an expert. And today we have got an expert who can actually handle that for us, which is really good. So we're going to record a couple of separate podcasts today. So the first one, exporting, second one, compliance. So if you've got any questions or comments, do pop them in for Marie-Louise or myself. We won't necessarily have a chance in the short time we've got to answer them on the actual live, but we'll definitely come in and make some comments. And Marie-Louise, I'll make sure you're hooked up in the Facebook group and on my profile and stuff as well, so that we can get some proper input answers to these very important questions, but which you shouldn't really be asking a free Facebook group of random people, folks. And today is the time to ask those questions. So with that said, Marie-Louise, sorry, get your name right. Are you okay to kick off and record our podcast?
Perfect. Happy.
Let's do this thing then. Right then.
Yeah.
Ladles and jelly spoons, boys and girls, welcome back to the 10K Collective podcast, the place to be for 6, 7, and 8-figure Amazon private label and e-commerce sellers. And today we are talking about a topic which has been a really hot topic in the mastermind that I run for 7-figure sellers in London for pretty much all of 2021, and that is how to import or export rather from UK to Europe. It's become a really difficult thing from something that was really easy and normal, and so it's been a real trauma for Amazon sellers that I know. And we've got Marie-Louise Boshoff from Z Logistics and Import Compliance with us today. Z is a set of people that actually, it's a sort of subset, if I understand, Marie-Louise, from a very big company that is focusing in on the needs of Amazon sellers, right? So welcome to the show, first of all. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, so Z is quite a new company. Probably wouldn't have heard of us yet, but we have positioned ourselves to be the experts because we've spent the whole year doing this. And I do agree with you, Michael. It's such an horrendous year for anyone in the e-commerce space in 2021. I think COVID was already bad enough last year, and then it just hit double as much this year. So very happy to be speaking to your listeners and just advising on how to make some sense out of this year.
Absolutely, yes. Some sense is a good phrase. Yeah, as you say, COVID 2020, bad, COVID plus Brexit, or sort of after effects of COVID. It's been a very weird time, right? We've had really off the hook demand, particularly UK had incredibly high e-commerce penetration as a percentage of retail. I think got up to like 40 odd %, is now back down to merely 25%. So that's been amazing on the demand side. And then the supply side, COVID made that pretty tricky. And then, of course, Brexit made it horrendous. So the first question, I'm not even going to go into why this matters because I think it's obvious, because it's such a big pain point, right? So but let's be specific and bring us up to date. So what are the big issues right now in late 2021 if you're trying to get goods specifically from the UK to the European Union? And let's say that's not very specific because obviously Germany, France, other places differ. But let's say the EU. What are the big issues that you're seeing on the ground for your clients at the moment?
So I think if we could label them all as just compliance as a whole, but it gets a little bit more detailed than that. The very first thing is this IOR compliance, or import of record compliance, and that's where the very first barrier comes in, and that's where most of our clients come to look for us. They tried something, tried to make it work, and then get stuck at customs, and now they go search. And that's mostly the term that they're searching for, is what is this import of record or indirect representative? Because when UK and the EU was still one big happy family, we didn't have that. That term didn't exist. It wasn't required. And now you've normally like had a streamlined solution, like you said, going to UK all the way to the EU. And now all of a sudden you are left with nothing, with a gap in that service. And that's the main thing. I think most of our clients who are UK-based clients, even US clients who store their goods in the UK, the problem is that they're now looking for this importer of record and they don't know who that is or why that's even necessary. And I think what I would like to just explain a little bit more is why you even need this importer of record, what it means, and how having that import of record can open that barrier and make it easier to then get your goods into the EU again. So that's the import side. That's where it gets very tricky. And then on top of that, you're adding this logistics compliance part where you have to actually prepare documents and all of that, which we'll discuss later as well. So it's an all-in-all compliance round issue.
Great, thank you for that. And it's important to clarify that it's not really a problem of physical good movement. I think that the geography hasn't changed. I mean, it just mentally feels like France has moved from literally what it is 20 miles or 22 miles from the nearest point from the UK to 2,000 miles, maybe 20,000 miles it feels sometimes. So before we plunge into that, yes, I'd love to. I'd love to know about import of record. Sounds like a sick kind of person would love to know about this, but I think it's incredibly important to clarify that. Before we even get into that, can you just explain? There's a few jargon words that knock around, and I'm not sure that I've ever heard super clear explanations of any of these. And they're discussed a lot. So can we have an explanation for these words? First of all, what is an import of record? There's also the word indirect representative. First question, is that the same thing? And what do they do?
So it is the same thing.
Okay.
Maybe like technically the definitions can differ here and there, but it fulfills the same need. So an importer of record, in very loose words, is an importer when there isn't one. So if we take most of the EU, especially Germany, you need someone based in Germany, a company based in Germany to act as an importer. So let's say you're based in the UK, you've been based there this whole time. When you file an export out of the UK, you're the company being the exporter when you file out of the UK. The problem is that there's that import side in Germany where someone needs to be the importer. And before Brexit, we didn't even have that exporter-importer definition because it didn't exist. It wasn't even an import-export transaction. Now someone needs to fulfill that importer space. And because you don't have an entity in Germany, you don't have an established warehouse or any physical presence in Germany, you as your own selling company can't be that importer. You can't go on the documents as being the importer. From the Germans' customs side, they need one person in Germany who they can go to for any questions on their customs clearance. And you're not based in Germany, so they're not looking for that. They're looking for someone in Germany with the expert and the knowledge to do that. And that's what that importer of record term is. It's literally the importer on the documentation. And that's where most of our sellers get it very wrong, because firstly, you're not the importer. Some of them try. You try to put your own name there, can't get it through. Secondly, a lot of sellers think that because you have a VAT registration or an EORI number, a German EORI number or an EU EORI number, you can ship to Germany, you established in Germany, but that's not the case. So an EORI and a VAT number gives you the right to trade, but it doesn't give you the right to import. So you need to actually be based in Germany. So that kicks you out of that importer seat. And then a lot of the sellers also try to put Amazon in that importer seat because your goods are going to an Amazon warehouse. They're based in Germany, they're established there. But Amazon specifically said they will not be the importer. They won't take that import liability. So now you're left with this empty gap of who can be the importer. And that's where an importer of record, or in some instances, an indirect representative, has different words wherever you go, different translations, unmelded, declarant, different words can be thrown around, but essentially it's whoever goes on the documentation on your behalf as your importer, and they would be the go-to person for German customs.
Thank you. That's very, very clarifying. And so VAT registration is not enough if you're UK based. EORI number, I presume that would be I guess it could be, yeah, that's probably going to be for UK-based businesses rather than US, isn't it? And yeah, you can't get Amazon to solve this one problem. They don't want to know any more than you do. So
Yeah.
other questions, direct fiscal representative, is that the same thing or how does that relate?
No, no. So direct fiscal representatives a lot more on the VAT side, and especially in the Netherlands, it's not fulfilling that exact same need. If you are shipping via the Netherlands, that's the way that they go. This imported term is not the same in Netherlands specifically, but direct fiscal representation is more for your VAT filing purposes, for you actually getting that VAT number in the first place. They're going to be your representative to the fiscal authorities. So it's not the same as getting your goods into the country. It's more a requirement for after the fact.
Okay, so you need an indirect representative or a importer of record to be the person who's willing to put their name down on the form as being the importer that will actually be accepted by the authorities. Once the goods are there, then what happens? The direct fiscal representative does what exactly?
So a direct fiscal representative, depending on which country in the EU you are importing into, will be responsible for helping you do your filings, your VAT filings, and actually be your representative to the tax authorities. So they'll help you collect your VAT to do the filings on that. And then the importer would have already left the transaction long before.
Okay, so there's two different things. So we're definitely going to need to have an importer of record or an indirect representative, pretty much the same thing, from what I
Yeah.
understand. And we will need to have a direct fiscal representative, which is there to be, in the firing line for you for tax purposes, I suppose. And then
Yeah.
also the other, sorry.
Sorry, Michael, just in some countries you don't necessarily need one. It's
Okay.
EU or country dependent. It's not a whole EU regulation at this point. But there's quite a lot of very, very good VAT providers out there who definitely can assist. Just making sure that you are 100% compliant from a VAT perspective, just so that you don't get those emails, those calls.
Yeah.
As a seller, you want to focus on selling, not on sitting on the phone with fiscal authorities.
100%. Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. So really, I suppose what you're saying is that it's tempting to bundle things together, as I suppose I just inadvertently did, which is the tax compliance and stuff and the importing. I guess you kind of have to get both right to be able to import in the first place, though, right? I presume that you can't just import stuff into, say, the Netherlands, if that's one of the countries that requires it, without a direct fiscal representative. Is that correct?
Yeah, so when it's a requirement to get a VAT number, then that's definitely something you have to do. So in order to import into any EU country, you need to have a VAT number, a VAT registration, and your direct fiscal rep will help you with that when it is required to get that VAT number. And even with these whole like the VAT changes in the EU, I think it's a hot topic as well, this IOSS system and all of that, regardless of how you sell in the EU, if you store stock in different countries, so let's say you have some stock sitting in a German warehouse and some sitting in a Spanish warehouse, you need a VAT registration in each. So it's more a VAT requirement as a starting entry point to get your goods in. And for that VAT requirement, if you store the stock there, that negates a VAT registration in the first place.
Okay, now there's just one more, one more that comes up quite often as another one word: responsible person. What does that mean, and when do we need them?
So, so that's definitely a very big topic at this point, especially if you were very happy in your UK pre-Brexit bubble for that. But responsible person is very much also after the fact. When something goes wrong with your products, who do they contact? And it's again, it goes back to that same principle. The authorities in Europe as a whole want someone in their country to be able to call up and ask these questions. And for import side, it would be the importer of record. But then after the fact, if something happens, let's say you are selling toys and someone chokes on a toy, for example, there needs to be a responsible person who is listed on that product. Authorities can call that actual responsible person. They're based in the country, they know everything about the product, and they can answer the questions and actually represent you when there's something going wrong. So for Amazon specifically, it is a requirement for most of your products. They'll also let you know that you need this responsible person, but it would be a good thing to get someone on your team who has very good compliance knowledge on the product side, to make sure that your products, when it needs that, has a good person, a good responsible person to answer those questions. But again, that can't be you. That can't be the seller, just because you're not based in the EU.
Wow. Okay. So it's weird. It feels a bit like the sort of level of complication, only with more weirdness because it's new. That the United States-based sellers greet when they go to Europe. They're like, "What is VAT? I never heard of that," or "I don't understand how it works." They're very comfortable with sales tax. VAT is alien. Same for me going to the US. I mean, I understand theoretically about sales tax, but it's not part of my sort of fiscal culture, if there is such a thing. But suddenly we got all these. We have to think about exporting to Europe, which of course, for UK-based people who've never done. I mean, I was born in the EU. I never left the EU really, except for the odd trips, until we all left in one go. So, yeah, it's kind of a mental shock, isn't it? And so, um, yeah, a couple of other questions. You keep mentioning specific countries. So you said when we talked about the importer of record or indirect representative, and you said especially in Germany. Why is that especially Germany? Are these things just purely country by country, or is there some EU-wide agreements, or how the country
There is,
specificness?
yeah, so there is some EU-wide agreements. The reason I'm specifically mentioning Germany so much is that the demand into Germany has grown tremendously. Sellers wanting to go into Germany to try and get their goods there. It is a massive market with a lot of unfulfilled potential. And because of that, because of this like spike in getting imports into Germany, the German customs have just become very pedantic. So that's why I'm mentioning it quite a lot. In some of the other EU states, you can still get away with a few things. Germany, definitely not. So that's why
Yeah.
I'm mentioning it so much. We've seen it. It's probably the country that we ship into the most at this point.
Yeah, I mean the Germans kind of. I mean this is not a cultural change in terms of business culture, if you like. That Germany's always been the biggest prize in Europe, and it's always the biggest pain in the butt. I'm trying not to swear on my own podcast here, because of course they are. If they have a rule in Germany, you actually have to stick to it, which for British people is a complete shock. I mean, like if you're supposed to wear a face mask on the tube, the underground system, or the subway, as Americans would call it, and nobody does. Whereas in Germany, you have a rule: you wear a mask, you wear a flipping mask, and it's the same here. Like I think for Germans, it's an alien concept. They should have a rule and not follow it. That just doesn't compute. And I'm kind of with them, but when it comes to importing, unfortunately, it means that it's a bit of a nightmare for us, right? But on the other hand, I would say, to be fair to the Germans, if they say they're going to do something, they generally do it. So if you tick all the boxes, your stuff
Yeah.
moves. And I've seen that with my clients, that when they do tick all the boxes and jump through the hoops, it works. Other countries seem to be a little bit more variable. I mean, what's your experience with that? I mean, is in, say, France or the Netherlands that you've mentioned, or other countries that are significant, how much does this actually work in reality, and how much variation from the theory are you seeing in reality?
So that's definitely something that we've, like, I could probably talk on for days. Is like you said, in Germany, we don't get surprises. We know that if we do A, B, C, and D, the goods will clear, everything will happen as according to plan. The valuation will be exactly like that. Even if it's more stringent, you know it happens to the book. In most of the other countries, especially France and Spain, where we've seen quite an increase in demand in the last month as well, is that they're only realizing how important e-commerce and imports into Amazon and Shopify and etc., those type of systems are, that they're now only trying to change a few things and practically make it a little bit harder to either import or try and get some more value out of imports. So we are seeing an increased effort from customs authorities in France and Spain, for example, but then it's not like it's not to the rule. It's normally a surprise, and our team knows exactly how to deal with it when it comes, but it's shocking actually. It's not A, B, and C could work on one shipment, and A, B, and C could not work on the other. Where in Germany, A, B, and C perfect. So that's definitely something that we're seeing a lot.
Yeah, it reminds me when I speak German fairly fluently, and because I kind of frightening brain that likes structure and stuff, and I guess German languages like the German people, it's very there's a lot of rules, but if you follow them, they're consistent. Whereas English is very
Yeah.
kind of strange, variable language, and the French are quite capricious in their kind of way of implementing stuff. That's always been that's a strong historically that culture hasn't moved a lot, and I think there is something it seems to be showing up consistently within this strange system that we've got here as well. So what was I going to say? Yes, the the other thing to say is I just had a thought that I've lost. Yes, one other specific question on jargon actually that you talked about paperwork. Let's talk about that for a second. The word commercial invoice turns up. Now, a lot of us use commercial invoices in China in order to, get a precise information communicated to the next stage after a purchase order, and it's needed for customs clearance going into, say, the USA if you're exporting from China to USA if you're UK based, or the same if you're UK based, etc., US based. But when it comes from UK to EU, it seems to have a sort of meaning of its own. So tell me a little bit about the commercial invoice and other bits of paperwork and what they mean and what do we need to do with them.
Yeah. So the commercial invoice is in layman's terms is your instruction manual to customs. So it would tell customs exactly what they need to do when they get this package, how they need to clear it, who's responsible for what part of it, who's actually the person bringing the goods in, and where it's going to go. And then apart from that, it also gives the exact dimensions of the package. So it helps to know exactly what package comes in. But then what adds a lot of complexity to it is that that's the document that drives the valuation, and that would drive how much duties, how much VAT, how much other non-refundable taxes you are going to pay. And that valuation is driven by what your product description is, the HS code, and then the actual unit value that you put to it. So what we do on our side quite a lot is every country has its own requirements for what that commercial invoice would look like, even if it's in the same EU, like even if it's an EU member state, France, Germany, Spain, they all differ. And even in just the translations, that you can't even just cross translate. It's very different between the member states, but it would give the exact like on how the import should work. When a customs official reads this commercial invoice, they know exactly what you're importing, at what value you're importing it at, and where it needs to go. So that's their instruction manual. The tricky part to that is how to fill it in. And I think the biggest pain point is the classification, the HS code classification. That's where we're seeing a lot of strain on our sellers. You have this classification that probably your supplier already put on a previous commercial invoice, but that classification has to be 100% correct. And again, especially in Germany, it gets quite tricky on German customs side. They are very picky on what the actual HS code should be. And as you can imagine, one HS code versus the other can flip your whole compliance process and what you have to present attached to that commercial invoice. That's the one big thing that we are seeing quite a lot. And then second to that is what that unit value needs to be.
Okay.
And that also differs.
Yes, because I understand the unit value in Germany is based on, it's not even the selling price, it's not the cost price, it's something else, isn't it? What is it based on these days?
So they're calling it the fallback method. So it's the retail price less any cost that you incur to get the goods into Germany. So at this point, how they're calculating it is the retail price, and then if you have a good courier provider or customs broker who actually filed this clearance correctly, they would say retail price less the VAT that you the VAT that you included in your retail price, less the Amazon fees. So your estimated Amazon fees, as you would see it on your account, you can deduct that as well. It's just
Yeah.
how you present that gets a little bit more difficult. If you don't present it the right way, the customs authorities will just use retail price and ignore all your cost deductions that you could put in.
Okay, interesting. So it sounds like it's getting a lot closer to what I would call landed costs. So in other words, it's the COGS plus the freights. And then, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room in the middle where it ends up being a bit higher. But it sounds like the Germans are kind of coming closer down to the idea of landed cost or cost price. Even that is, I've never heard of that in any kind of context as a way of calculating value. That sounds kind of unique and quite annoying, but we have to deal with it. So the other thing I was going to ask you, you said with the commercial invoice, the tricky part is, and you used the phrase how to fill it in. Now that implies you've got a pre-existing form that you fill in. Now, from my commercial invoices that I've ever used, to get goods from China to UK, China to UK, and then on to Europe. But I've only done that pathway personally pre-Brexit because I just didn't want to get involved. And I think I can see why. And I've done China to US. In each case, the commercial invoice was something I basically made up according to sort of vague pro formas that I got on the internet, frankly, and you know, and checked with friends or, you know, who were also in the same game. So it wasn't like made up completely from scratch. But it wasn't a form that I'd been given by the US authorities or by the UK authorities. So are you suggesting that a commercial invoice is now a rigid format these days, or how does that work?
So still not a rigid format. I think we internally have our format that we tried and tested, and it's been working, but it's not a set format on how it should look. I don't think customs will ever do that because then they bound themselves as well. But it's not. It's whatever you would put on the documents. We kind of know what they would be looking for, and we refine and we refine as we go. But there is definitely not a downloaded PDF format that you can get from a custom site, which would make things a lot easier to do. But yeah, it's not something that's easily available.
Yeah, it kind of would because they basically sounds like they have very rigid requirements, but there's no rigid format up front for how to tick those boxes, which is sort of bureaucratic thinking that drives me a bit nuts. I can cope with people being very precise in their requirements, but then you should be precise in your instructions, in my opinion. But I guess we don't. I guess the Germans probably tell it as clearly as anyone else, and at least, as you say, if you get consistency, you know what's going on. Couple of other thoughts, and then we ought to wrap up fairly soon because I don't want to overwhelm people. I want to, as bite-sized as we can be in an area as complex as this. So the implication for me, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this, if you're going to sell in the EU more broadly, we'll leave VAT compliance to one side, but with the important proviso that you said, as you said, just a reminder, you need to be VAT registered in any country you're going to be selling in, and indeed, of course, storing goods in. So if you're going to sell in Germany, hello Poland, just saying, I'm not going to get any further with that, or Czech Republic. But what's your advice then? Should we be trying to export from the UK to Germany because it's a more consistent pathway, even though it's expensive? Or should we be risking France because they're not as likely to check? Or should we look at Netherlands or some other thing? What's your advice as a sort of pathway that's the best pathway, if you will?
Michael, my question is why not do all of them? So why not go Germany and France and Poland and wherever you could have that stock? I think the easiest, maybe more stringent, but the biggest and best market would be to go to Germany. I think it's easy because they have these clear instructions. But if you have the right people on your side and the right expertise in it, all of the EU is an open door. So it's definitely not something that you should be closing. I don't think any seller should be closing out to one EU country. If you're opening that door into EU, why not do all of them?
Okay, fair enough. I like your optimism. Yeah, I guess the answer is probably because of the pain level. But if you, as you say, if you've got the right expert on one side, so which means that we will talk in a second about what Z does. But just talking of what you do, talk us through an overview of the process then. If I come to you and I say, okay, Z, so I think you guys know what you're doing, and I would like to get some goods. Let's say I've got, I don't know, 10 pallets as a sort of moderate sized order. It's not a freight, it's not a container, but it's not just a couple of boxes either. And I want to get them over to, I've got a 3PL in Germany. This is like an example scenario. I'm not saying everyone would be the same. And you're going to ship it over to them, and they're going to then drip feed it into Amazon FBA. So what's the sort of basic process? What's the order of events that needs to happen for those goods to go from wherever they are in the UK in a warehouse to successfully selling in Amazon Germany, for example?
Yeah, so I think the very first step is we do quite like an onboarding process with any seller that we take on to firstly make sure that they are as compliant as they need to be. So just from like VAT registrations, things like that, helping a little bit to make sure that you are compliant from that sense. If you don't have a VAT registration or your number set up, URI numbers we can apply on your behalf, or we have a sister company who can also help with VAT registrations and fiscal rep and all those type of things. And then after that, like an assessment, making sure your product is compliant, having this responsible person, having the actual correct labels, things like that. These things change all the time. So making sure when you do import it is compliant. But then after that, it's getting the actual weights and dimensions of these 10 pallets, quoting you on some freight. We also have freight options, so air freight, road freight, to get you a competitive quote there. And then we prepare this commercial invoice. So we would get your HS code classifications absolutely sorted, making sure you have the right HS codes, get the retail prices and Amazon fees from you or from your Seller Central account, and making sure that that's as smooth as possible. So the only thing you have to worry about is giving us a little bit of piece of information here and there. But the goal is that we then give you this perfectly accurate commercial invoice so that you can attach that to your boxes or to your pallets. And then it's scheduling the pickup. So whether that's your own provider or whether it's us helping you with road freight or air freight, it would be picking up the goods from your warehouse. At that point, it's like you move out of the transaction, you don't worry, you move on to the next thing. And what we then do in the back end is make sure that when it gets to customs, we give them all the documentation that they need. So it would be this commercial invoice that we perfectly consign, and then any other compliance documents. So if you have like a trademark that we have to submit, or a declaration of conformity, or a commercial document to show that you actually own whatever rights there is to sell, we present that to customs as well. Can get very tricky. We've seen some products where it can be one document to submit, other products, cosmetics, those type of products where it goes to about 5 documents that you need to submit. But we prepare the shipping pack that we give our customs brokers. And by that point, the only thing that you worry about is when it actually gets to the 3PL. And then from there, it's drip feeding. It's all on you. If that 3PL was an Amazon warehouse, we get it there in time. We book through our freight providers, we book that shipment, and then it's all done.
Yeah, it sounds good. And this is a reminder really to me of why Brexit was such a big thing, that people are just thinking, oh, it's just a bit of tariffs added to stuff. I'm like, no, it's not. It's a ton of paperwork that's going to be very unstable. And lo and behold, it's exactly what I thought it was going to be. But there you go. I don't get to run the British government. It is pretty much as bad as it looked, and it's fortunately stabilized enough, I think, for experts like you to be able to give reasonably definitive answers. Although, as you say, the French and the Spanish, as ever, the French like to be variable. So nothing has changed in Europe for hundreds of years. In some ways, the kind of cultures have stuck. The Germans are precise. The Brits are trying to be super independent all the time, and the French are being capricious. So hey, some things don't change, but they all buy goods, and so it's worth the sweat, I would say, particularly the Germans. Now, one important thing you just said, you kind of book in shipments and stuff, so you're getting stuff moved around the place. Are you guys just basically freight forwarders, or what should we even think of you? And if you're not a freight forwarders, what's the difference between what you do and a freight forwarder? Kind of clarify that for me a bit.
That's a very good question, Michael. So we're not freight forwarders. We are the compliance side, the importer of record. To make a very clear distinction, we act as the importer of record, but we organize the freight. So we have freight providers, road freight providers, air freight suppliers. So we've contracted with the likes of FedEx, DHL, UPS. We have some road freight networks that we set up as well from the UK to the EU and Germany specifically. And we arrange that and organize and make it as streamlined as possible. So you don't have to go and book on the FedEx website to get your shipment through. And then because of our high volume, we have quite competitive rates as well. So then you benefit from that. But we're not the actual freight forwarders. We don't own planes and cargo and things like that to move them across, but we organize that for you.
Okay, so practically speaking, that sounds quite similar to what a lot of freight forwarders do, because they don't mostly own the infrastructure, that they just kind of put together different bits, like UPS does this and this shipping line does that, I guess. So sounds quite similar from a outside perspective, although I respect the fact that it's not quite the same. But so what is, if you wanted to summarize for us what it is that Z offers, what is it you do in a nutshell then for the sellers? It's really enabling everything that isn't actually just physically moving goods. Is that right? I mean, just summarize for me.
That's exactly it. So, Michael, you said at the beginning when it was all just UK and EU, or one happy family, it felt as if France was just next door. And that's what we want to do. We want to make global feel local for you. We want to bring France closer again, and make it feel one big happy family. So what Z offers in that is that we take away all the burden on from getting your goods from point A to Z and making it as easy as possible. And we, in that whole thing, the four big things that we offer is getting your goods there. So we actually arrange the freight for you. Like I said, we organize with our freight providers. We act as the import of record when you can't. So we fill that shoes there as well. We do your product compliance for you and make sure you're as compliant as you were when it was all just one EU family. And then lastly, we consign and perform this whole process in such a way that you still get that VAT back and that it's not a cost for you. So that's our whole product offering in four very easy steps.
Nice. Yeah, it sounds very straightforward. So we have like all good podcasts, little call to action at the end, which is amazingfba.com/ZEE or ZEE if you're an American. I'm presuming, let me just double check this, that you could help UK based sellers with UK companies, but also you would be able to help other people around the world, such as, I guess, Australia, America, Canada as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's
Great.
100%. So from anywhere in
Perfect.
the world getting into the EU, and Michael, just on top of that, it can be any country out of the EU as well. So we also ship into the US, Canada, Australia, Singapore, Japan, anywhere where there's an Amazon warehouse, we can help you get your goods there.
Okay. Yeah, that's worth having. I mean, obviously, we focus particularly on being a bit selfish while thinking of the needs of my clients really in the mastermind. But yeah, we very much focus on the UK, but it's not the only place with problematic customs and import people. I mean, I know that the US every so often forces you to strip down an entire container randomly and then make you pay for it. So it's not the only tricky place to import to, right? So yes, that's good to know. So you can kind of be a bit of a one-stop shop, I guess, for somebody who's got a lot of different marketplaces at play. If you've got, Amazon, US, Canada, Germany, UK, for example, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
One contact and we can take you global.
Excellent. That's always going to be helpful to take the pain out of it as well. So, have you got any special offers that we need to know about, or what other enticements can you give us to come and check you out and use your services?
So we have a special offering for anyone listening to Michael's podcast or live stream, anywhere where you log into Amazing FBA and you hear about us. You can get £100 off your first shipment with us. So that would be £100 off the collective of the freight, the IRR and the compliance, to make it easy for you to go across. And we'll also offer a 2-hour free compliance assessment for any products that you want to have assessed into a new country.
Yeah, and that itself, I think 2 hours that's a lot of your time. So I think that's a very valuable offer, or particularly if anyone's got a chance to work with somebody. And yeah, it's kind of a sales call for anyone, if they'll give you a free assessment. But I always suggest to everyone that I know, like off air as well, privately, go and get a free assessment from somebody who's an expert in an area when it's very complex. And this for sure is. So we're going to talk about international compliance shortly. But just remains for me to say, for now, Marie-Louise Bossoff from Z. Very interesting and informative talk. There's certainly clarified a few things that have been knocking around for a few months in the discussions I've been having. So very, very helpful stuff, and very grateful to you for clarifying this slightly terrifying area in e-commerce. But on the other side of which, we've got to remember there are hungry consumers who want to buy our stuff. So it's a really valuable service to everyone. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Michael.
Great, that's us done. I've just realised I'm looking at the meetings. I haven't got to dash off as quickly as I thought, so I'm okay to keep going. If you're okay to do so, we covered some of the aspects of international compliance, but if we want to keep going and focus on that, that's probably going to be valuable as well. Is that good? Excellent.
Yeah.
Right then, folks. Sorry to the live audience. This is what happens behind the scenes. Now, before the scenes, as it were. So a very strange phrase. Right, I'll stop blabbering. Let's get recording. Here we go. Ladles and jelly spoons, boys and girls, welcome back to the 10K Collective podcast, the place to be for 6, 7, and 8-figure sellers, a subset of the amazing FBA podcast, which are just for all UK-based sellers. This is a pretty international one, but if you're UK-based, you're going to be very advised to listen very carefully. We're talking about international compliance, and I think it's there's a bit of an EU focus at the moment because it's just such a tricky one, but we can talk more broadly. We're talking to Marie-Louise Bossoff from Z Logistics and Import Compliance, and we had a very interesting discussion about how to export to the EU from the UK, or indeed if you're US based trying to get stuff in from your UK stock. So welcome back to the show, Marie-Louise. It's interesting stuff. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks, Michael. Very, very nice of you.
Coming back, you didn't run away screaming after I'd asked you questions about fiscal representatives. You're obviously made of stern stuff. So let's talk about compliance, and we can. I think I'm probably going to be fairly EU centered just because it feels to me like that's a newer, more problem area for most people, including US based sellers who are trying to make sense of moving their goods into Europe, and it's famously a difficult place for compliance. But tell me a bit about why compliance matters. Don't we just leave that to our manufacturers to take care of certificates and annoying stuff like that? Can't we just outsource that?
So I wish it was that easy, Michael. If it was, we would have had 1 million sellers already moving their goods across. I think what we need to consider is that manufacturers are also only looking at the one market that they are supplying, and every single marketplace that you go into, even if it's in the EU as a whole, the requirements are different. So there's some centralized or similar regulations in the EU, but as soon as you go quite detailed into one country or the other, gets very technical, and unfortunately the manufacturers can only deal with that much as well. But what adds a little bit of complexity to it is they're not the final ones selling it, and that's where you are the ones taking most of the burden. And to be honest, if I was a customs agent or someone working at the customs authorities or even at the government after, the last person to have touched that goods is the first person I'm going to go to ask the questions. And that's where you would come in and bear all the answers, or bear the burden to give all the answers.
Yeah, it's a very good principle to bear in mind. Last person to touch the good is the first person to get asked the questions. That's a very good mantra, actually. I think it probably is something that resellers need to think through a little bit more, is that although obviously the brand owner is responsible for compliance and safety and things like that, you probably are going to be in the firing line if something really goes badly wrong. So it's worth bearing in mind. But I guess we're primarily focused in this podcast, and certainly in today's discussion, aren't we, on people who actually are the brand owners, I suppose, so private labelers, custom products, brands, whatever the difference is, people who are responsible for the goods, I guess. So what are the main problems that you say, or put it another way, what are the main mistakes you see the sort of small and medium enterprise level people making in this area?
So I think maybe before we go into those problems, we grouped compliance into 4 very overarching categories.
Okay.
So the first of that is safety. The second, documents. Third, testing, and then lastly, labeling. And within each of those, we see quite some issues and things that are often missed. On the safety side, I think we always try and assume our products are as safe as possible. But on our side, we believe anything can go wrong, and you have to preempt for all that can go wrong. And in each, let's say, region that you go into, Europe as a whole has a very big safety standard, the REACH compliance standard. You have to make sure your products are compliant with that. You can be ISO compliant, EN compliant, etc. But what makes the safety compliance very difficult is that you don't necessarily get a certificate to say, okay, my product is now safe. You have to self-assess whether your product is as safe as possible, and that can involve quite a lot of things. So that's the very first thing. It's so difficult to make sure that your product is safe. You had to think about all the different scenarios and basically like a movie, what could go happen and why it could go wrong and what would the penalty be. And unfortunately, that's where it gets tricky. You don't have a certificate saying, I did all this, I made it compliant, so sorry that something went wrong. And that's where safety gets quite technical, quite detailed, and quite costly, because to make sure your products are safe, you'll probably have to do a lot of testing for that.
Yeah, I guess that's there's a whole area here that I think gets kind of was overlooked a great deal in the early days of private labeling, and that's just true for me as well. Because I started in 2014, I just did what I was told, and it was very marketing led. But the truth is that that there's a lot of liability here, and one of the things that I would caution people against is just kind of skipping over it. Because even if you manage to get your goods imported, if you want to sell your business, and most people aspire to that, trust me when I say that you are going to have a really torrid time in the due diligence process, because the private equity companies, or especially, but also aggregators, will go through everything with a fine tooth comb. And I do know that one of the people that I know who sold a seven-figure business recently had quite a lot of topical stuff that goes on the skin or whatever, or is ingestible. I think maybe it was for animals or something, but nevertheless, the the deal nearly fell out of bed because he didn't have some kind of paperwork about this, and I think that's very common. So the idea that we can just wing it, even if you have done up to this point, I would suggest is that era is probably over. But the good news is the era when people buy Amazon businesses is now, whereas 7 years ago there was no such thing. People just didn't do that. So I guess there's pros and cons. So you mentioned safety, obviously kind of a scary side. You mentioned testing. So this sounds really scary and expensive and complex. How do we? What are the sort of minimum requirements for this, and how do we keep this cost effective? Because it sounds like that could explode into a cost center very quickly.
No, definitely. I think the first thing is to make sure that it is actually required. And this depends on the type of classification for your product. So certain types of products, especially if it falls into pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, anything that even comes near a child, that's where testing will definitely be mandatory. And to add a level of complexity, it's most likely even mandatory to give that testing document at customs. So you probably won't even get your goods in before or without it, but it is quite a costly exercise to do. So for us, what makes it very important is that you have to make sure it is absolutely necessary, and that you partner with someone or have a testing lab or facility that's very much focused on your product type. So for example, if you are doing children's products, it's going to be very expensive to go test it at a lab that focuses on pharmaceuticals, because they're going to probably over-test your product. So first thing first is make sure you have the right classification before you start on any testing routes, and then have a testing game plan, as I like to call it. It's some products you're going to put on the market first, have those tested first, and then start fixing some of the things as it comes out, so that by the end, when your testing's done, you've had a very streamlined process in that.
Yeah, you make a very good point that sometimes you can go over the top with this stuff. I mean, so two really simple things: make sure it's required, because some people are very sort of fearful and will sort of tick every box possible in life, and I'm not sure that's necessarily me. I go into phases of that, because my dad was a lawyer, so I go into sort of lawyer phase every so often and just try and tick every single box possible. And the truth is, if it's not necessary to have a document, don't create one, because you're probably just going to create a rod for your own back, aren't you? Because then somebody will start looking at it, and even though you don't need the document, if you provide it, they will look at it and then start criticizing it because it wasn't filled in correctly. So that's that's a classic error. I've seen people fall into that one. So you mentioned that was one category of safety, which obviously is a big one. What are the other ones? You mentioned documents, labeling, and testing, if I've got them right. I'm not sure I captured those. So what are the other big mistakes or things that you need to watch out for in those other areas?
So a little bit more on the document side. So this can go quite deep. It depends on your product category. So again, if you classify your product correctly, you'll know what type of documents you need. But it starts very high level on like a product certificate. So most of your products, depending on the category, needs a specific certificate. So example, if you shipping toys into the USA, you need a children's protection certificate. And normally it's a self-issued certificate, or you get the testing provider who tested your products to issue that. But that's saying that you are aware that it is a product under that legislation, and that you are bound to that legislation, and that you put your stamp on it saying that I will take all the burden with this. And that's the first part. It's a very high level like product certificate, but it can get very detailed after that. So we've seen clients who have to give technical certificates for specific things. So if it's an electronic good, you might need a technical data sheet or something to back your product. If it's a pharmaceutical item, you might need a whole ingredient list to give. So it can be the documents as a whole you can probably spend 4 days on, or even more if I get to the whole team in here to chat about it. But it can get very detailed. But every legislation requirement sets out what document it would be. And there might be templates for it. It might be self-issued, or you might need to get some authority or testing provider to issue it. I think one of the other big examples here is when you start working in this responsible person space, where you have your designated responsible person's document saying that you've actually appointed them. So that's also another document that you could be required to submit.
And just to reference, the responsible person thing is what we talked about in the last episode with UK to EU export, right? And I guess that would apply to people exporting from China to the, well, I suppose US based sellers. Sorry, let me try that sentence again. I guess it would apply also to US based sellers exporting from China to EU, right? They've got to get the responsible person on the documentation, and then they've also got to include whatever safety and other sort of certificates you got there. Which is, yeah, I can feel everyone starting to sweat along with me here. That this is definitely something you do not want to be doing on your own, I would suggest. So, just tell me a little bit about this. This phrase has come up a couple of times: self-tested or self-certified. I mean, obviously, none of us really want to do this. So, what's the difference between self-certified and the other options? Who else would do it? Like a government lab, or is it a commercial? I mean, how does that work?
So it depends on the type of document. So it's self-declared. So you self-issue the document. So mostly in that case, it's like a template where you put your name, what product it is, and where and when it was manufactured. So it's almost just putting the detail there that a customs authority would need. It's not saying that it's certified, like FDA certified or pharmaceutical certified. So it's for the more easier products that you often require this self-declaration. And it's basically just putting all the details on one piece of paper for anyone to see if it's necessary to go to it. But when it gets to the more tricky products, the pharmaceuticals, the cosmetics, and when it gets to food, for example, you'll not get away with a self-issued or self-declared certificate, and that's where you'll need to go to a provider to do that. So for a pharmaceutical company or someone, and any product can fall into pharmaceuticals. We've had one recently that we've dealt with, pet eye drops. And that fell into this big pharmaceutical chunk, which requires quite a lot of testing and a certificate from that testing provider saying that it is safe for use. And that's the certificate or the document that you'll then show. But if it's textiles or things like that, most probably we won't need that big of a self-declared or even government issued certificate.
So you mentioned obviously pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, food. I would kind of expect those to have high compliance requirements because they're going on or in the body, right? But you mentioned childcare items. I know that a couple of my clients who are in the childcare space broadly have had really, really high quotes from their insurance brokers, and I guess that's the flip side of that, what they perceive as a risk to be, and I guess their compliance implications might be quite high. So how does that work with what sort of products fall into sort of things where you can't self-certify it, whatever you're getting, you have to get external certification within that sort of childcare space? Because that feels like a sort of bit of an in-betweeny category that I wouldn't have expected to be as nasty as it turns out to be.
Yeah. And Michael, just it gets even a little bit more complex than that. It might not even be, you might not even see it as a toy or something for like an infant, anything that's marketed to children. So if it's marketed for use for, let's say, for ages below 12, it automatically classifies as this children's product. And what we've seen is in the US, you need to get testing and etc. done by a third party, but your certificate is self-issued. But the testing is quite strenuous, where in the UK and the EU, the document requirements are actually a little bit less. But when it gets to that responsible person, that's where it gets a little bit trickier. But high level, it's anything that's marketed to children as a whole. So it can be clothing, it can be anything for infants, it can be food marketed to children as well. So anything that could come in contact with a child, that's definitely a very highly regulated product. So we can't really put it on this overall like toys or like baby bottles, for example. It gets very broad in that sense. But in the EU as a whole, the document requirements are not as stringent, but the safety requirements are then you need to self-issue. And that's where that REACH and GPSD compliance gets very difficult, because you won't necessarily get a certificate to say, I did all this and I went and I looked, made sure that my products were safe for children. And that's why it gets so difficult to do.
Wow. Okay, so this is definitely an area where it was kind of more obvious here than DIY freight forwarding, which I've seen people do in Crash and Burn. But this is an area where it's really obvious that we can't just do this ourselves, or at least it isn't obvious to the people on my Facebook group asking people about compliance. Guys, apart from asking someone like Marie-Louise, who does this all day, every day for a living, please don't ask random Facebook groups of people about really complex technical things that could bring you lawsuits. Please just talk to an expert. So talking of which, I just got one quick question before we talk about Z and what you guys do with compliance. How do we assess whether an expert in compliance is the right person to do the job for us? Because it's obviously critical that we get it right. Otherwise, we could be open to lawsuits, or more mundanely, we just will get rejected at customs, which is not great if you've got to contain a load of stuff. That's not that mundane, actually. That would be a bad day. So how do we assess the competence of an expert to hire for this? It's a difficult question to answer, I realize, but I think it's going to be top of mind for anyone who's listening right now.
So we're dealing with the same thing, because obviously we're not vets or pharmaceutical companies, so we have quite a lot of suppliers that we also contract with, and it is a very difficult question to answer, because you can't even just put the tag on how much expertise they have or how long they've been in the space. But for me, there's one like agreeing factor, and it's you get what you pay for, and that's a very it's a sad cost to bear. But if you ending up paying a really cheap service, it's probably not the right service for you, because you're going to be ending up in instances where you don't want to be in. And we've seen that some providers offer, let's say, a quarter of another provider, and that's already a red flag. How much effort are they really going to go into to make sure that your product is compliant? Do they have the right resources? Do they have a good enough team? So that's one thing that we're using as our benchmark. I'm not saying that you need to go for the very, very expensive guys, but unfortunately, the cheaper the service, the more likely you are to land up in the boiling pot when things do go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how markets for goods or services tend to find a certain level, because there are certain costs and certain ways of doing things that you have to do if you're doing it well. So I would be suspicious as well. If somebody's 25% cheaper than somebody else, then that might be that they're just more efficient or got a smaller team or something. But if they are 25% of the price, i.e. like 4 times cheaper, that indicates they've got a completely different cost structure, which may mean that their team is outsourced abroad. And if that works, that's fine, but it's more likely that they're cutting corners. So I would say, yeah, a red flag doesn't mean that you condemn somebody, but it means that you should investigate further, I guess, right? So I think, yeah, it's a very valid point. Yeah, it's a sad thing to have to pay for, but I think what we need to do is, as e-commerce sellers, is kind of go, on the one hand, it's not 2014 and we can't just get away with it. On the other hand, it's not 2014 and FBA businesses are seen as sellable entities and everyone's buying them left, right, and centre. So there is a great future if you get your paperwork right, not only in being able to export your goods now and without having trouble with the German authorities, for example, or the US ones, who are super strict as well, I think, my experience. But also the upside is you'll have a smooth path to a business exit in future. And I really want to emphasize that, because I don't care whether it's doing proper financials or compliance, in this case, on the safety and other types of certification. Doing things properly and professionally is just really, really important now. We're after amateur hours past. And so if you've got to pay somebody to do this stuff, I think you just got to see that as a cost of doing business. And it's one of those things that nobody wants to pay for, but once it's done, you've got that, you can put it in the bank and then trot it out when the lawyers from some private equity company that's offering you several $1 million for your product, your company, I should say, but which is your product. you can trot this stuff out. And yeah, having seen up front, up close and personal, how ugly it gets when you don't have that stuff, it's worth getting, is what I would say. So Z offers obviously a lot of stuff in this area. You clearly know an awful lot about it. What are the main things that Z does in the specific area of compliance?
So we have a whole dedicated team just to this. As I mentioned earlier, each product gets so unique and tricky. We've seen from pet eye drops to brake pads to pregnancy pillows, and each product gets very, very unique. So we have a dedicated person to assist with that exact product. So we get as much information as possible, ingredient lists, all of the things that make your product unique. So that's the very first thing. We gather all this information from you, and then we do a full assessment on what you need for your product. So in each of those categories, do you need any specific safety testing or anything done? Do you need some additional thing on your label for going into a specific country? Do you need a specific document? Do you need a specific testing procedure for a specific item? So that's the very first thing we do, an assessment. And then on top of that, after we've done this assessment and we give it to you, we go look for the people so that you don't have to. So in each country, there's probably a specific person that you need for your specific item, and we'll go find them and do as much as possible so that you don't have to do it. Fill in the forms, get the quotes, do all the hard work, have a whole team dedicated to it, so that by the time that we get back to you on what you can do to get your product compliant, you've sorted out all the selling and the advertising and all of that, and we've sorted out all the compliance.
Great. And what I would say is that the logic of this, whether you use Z or not, obviously we brought Z on because I have reason to believe after, vetting, because I'm quite careful who we have on as guests, that Z know their business. But what I would say is, as a broader thing for sellers to think about, and if you're listening on the live, this is just food for thought for you, trying to do everything yourself implies that it's somehow free, but it isn't. It's a massive opportunity cost. And if you're good at picking product markets, which is an art, and not everyone's good at that, and product development, which is really difficult, and that's an art in itself, and or marketing on Amazon, all of them are arts. Those are things you're good at that have commercial value to your business. If you start becoming an amateur lawyer or an amateur compliance expert, then you are taking away your expertise in the areas and applying it to areas where you're dumb. And that doesn't make sense to me. That is not a sensible use of your time. If you look at the numbers and the delay, that's not even accounting for the delays that come if you try and do your stuff yourself and you don't know what you're doing. The further I get on in this business, Marie-Louise, one thing that strikes me is that a lot of things in small business owners, and I do this all the time, so I get it. We have a how head. We are very operations focused. How do I solve this? How do I do this myself? And I think that needs to be flipped on its head. It's not a how, it's who. Who can do this for me? So I don't try and pretend to be an expert in freight forwarding, exporting to the European Union, or compliance, to name but a few things that you guys do. So good information as ever. Thank you very much for some clarity. If people want to work with you, then they can go over to amazingfba.com/Z, ZEE or ZEE if you're on that side of the pond. And obviously that assessment that you do, I think you said that you do like a 2-hour assessment call, is that right? So that's obviously in itself very valuable. So I would encourage anyone to get that for free. Yes, of course, it's a sales call, but you don't have to say yes. At least get to pick the brains of experts for free. Always valuable, right? Any other offers that you have for listeners or watchers?
So apart from the 2-hour free assessment, we're also offering £100 off on your next shipment with us. So that would be on the full invoice for logistics, compliance, and acting as this importer of record. So it's £100 off for any listener who says that they heard from us from Michael's podcast or 10K Collective or Amazon FBA. We'll be happy to apply that to your account.
Great stuff. Well, look, sobering stuff, but nevertheless, these are real problems. And I think just a last thought with you, last question really, do you find that the compliance issues turn up when you're trying to do import and export? Is that where the sort of superficial red flags get raised with the authority these days?
Yeah, that definitely is. I think the more the authorities learn about e-commerce, I think just maybe one comment is that e-commerce as a whole has been around for a few years, but cross-border e-commerce, not as much. And that's where the customs authorities are only joining the party now and only realizing now that they also have to make aware or get themselves aware of these the e-commerce requirements. And the more and more they get to that, the more stringent they get as well. So we're definitely seeing, even just this year, we've seen an increase in the compliance requirements, increase in the amount of things that customs ask for, detail that they go into. So it's been a service that we were working on in the back end, and now we're realizing that it's probably something that a seller would not be able to go without.
Yeah, I think you put it right now. That won't be able to do without. I think it's funny how this sort of space has developed in the time that I've been in it now, about 7 years now, pretty much to the day. But yeah, I think again, it comes to that point where we have to kind of grow up, really. In other words, it's not even just about the lawyers for some acquirer in 2 or 3 years' time saying, where on earth is your certificate for X? We can't buy it without that. But it's all, and what is the liability going to be? And the lawyers rushing in going, we can't buy your business, or we're going to have to take some giant sum off you as a sort of liability or whatever. I've seen complex deals done where a lot of the money that you wanted to keep gets held back, like several £100,000. It's not small, but also what you're saying to me now is like, you can't get away with it that long. It's like right now. So unfortunately, none of us wants to pay money for compliance, but it seems very necessary. And if it is necessary, we better get trusted partners. And you guys sound like you really know your business. So thank you very much for coming on and helping us to navigate these treacherous waters, I should say. Marie-Louise Boshoff from Z, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay, so that's our live. That's our podcast recording done. So I'm trying to talk and type, but I clearly can't do both, like walk and chew gum. So if you're listening live, or you're watching on the replay, or listening or watching live, I should say, or on the replay, feel free to pop any questions or comments for Marie-Louise in here. This is one of those rare occasions where I'm going to encourage you, if you're in the Facebook group, so we're broadcasting this live to the Amazing FBA Facebook group, I'm encouraging you to ask a question in the Facebook group about legal compliance and stuff. However, I'm suggesting you ask Marie-Louise, not me, and certainly not anyone else in the community, because random people are not the place to find out answers to tricky questions. But this is your opportunity, so I would use it. We'll make sure, Marie-Louise, I'll add you to that community in the next couple of days. And meanwhile, yeah, thanks so much for coming on live. Very clarifying. I think I've learned a few things about EU exporting and what some of those words mean that knock around. It's been an alphabet soup year, hasn't it, really, somehow, for that area. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on. It's been I wasn't say fun exactly, but you certainly explain things in a really clear-minded way, which is extremely helpful. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, Michael. It's been fun for me. So
Great.
I'm very happy to have spoken to you.